Mr. Dale Atkins, I'm in attendance.
Thank you, sir. We'll be beginning the meeting shortly. You're live in the room and we're on YouTube. Can you hear us? Chairman, can you hear us?
Oh, yes, yes. Hear you
Great,
very
thank
well.
you.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir, we can.
Good morning, Dale.
Good morning.
Hey, Dale.
How are you feeling?
We're good. And Bill Gross is actually here in person as chair of the Finance Committee.
Good morning.
Great, great. Good morning, Bill.
How's everything in Baxley?
Everything in Baxley is hot and dry.
Hot and dry.
We need some rain, but it's everything else is well.
Good. Just get everybody up to date.
I mean, he's welcome to squeeze right in here between us.
What's the password to the? I'm trying to use the guest, so I didn't
Good
take
morning.
Well, we didn't know how many you were gonna bring. I didn't see on that. Army of one.
Oh, yeah, I think it's Captain Jekyll.
Greg, everything okay this morning?
Excuse me?
Is everything good this morning?
I see it almost for anything.
Disconnect.
Good morning, it's Bob Kruger joining.
Good morning, Mr. Bob.
Oh, Dale, how you doing this morning?
Good. How's the recovery going?
It's coming, thank goodness.
Well, great, great.
Good morning, Mr. Kruger. We are live in the room and live on YouTube.
Good morning, Anna.
And do you have any indication that Glenn is on yet?
Hello?
Good morning.
Hey, it's Mark.
Hey, Commissioner Williams, you are live in the room and on YouTube. We'll be beginning shortly.
Hello, is someone there?
Yes, sir. You-
Glenn.
Yes, sir.
Hey, good morning, Buster joined.
Good morning.
Good morning, Buster.
We're getting ready to start soon. You are live in the room and on YouTube.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes,
it's a little past 9:30. We know that Joy is calling on. We're waiting to hear from Joe. But before you get started, I'll set the picture of the room for you. We're at the meeting room atop of the golf course. There are several staff members here, and we're broadcasting live on YouTube, as well as, of course, we've got some speakers here in the room and mics this morning. We have a couple of citizen attendees, and then we assume that the media will be joining us by YouTube. And also, the Finance Committee Chairman, Bill Gross, is here in person. So he will be able to thump us on the head if we go too long. So with that, Mr. Chairman, let me turn it over to you.
thank you, Jones. At this time, we're June 2nd, 2022, called board meeting of the Jekyll Island Authority Board is now called to order. Welcome everyone in attendance. And Anna, would you please give us a roll call?
Yes, sir. Mr. Dale Atkins,
Here.
Mr. Bob Kruger,
Here.
Mr. Bill Gross,
Here.
Commissioner Mark Williams,
Here.
Dr. Buster Evans,
Here.
Mr. Glenn Willard.
Here.
Ms. Joy Birch Meeks is not currently on the line, but will be joining shortly. Mr. Joseph B. Wilkinson Jr. is not currently on the line, but will also be joining shortly. Mr. Tripp Tollison will be absent today. Mr. Chairman, you have a quorum.
Thank you. For the record, we have a quorum. We received no public comments online for this meeting. At this time, I'll call on Bill Gross, Finance Committee Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome to the Finance Committee today. And today's topic will be the 2023 proposed budget. At this time, Jones, Executive Director, and Marjorie Johnson, Chief Financial Officer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As board members and public have had access to the board packet, we won't go through it in excruciating detail this morning. Some of you may feel like it's excruciating detail, but we will hit some highlights and answer any questions. We know there have been a couple of board members who have had discussions with me about a couple of items I'll bring forward to try and make sure those are addressed, and just some highlights. The first highlight that I would like to mention is the FY23 proposed budget with revenues of $35,466,720.46. That is the largest JIA budget proposed in history. And so it's an amazing budget year that we are proposing. Obviously, there are lingering uncertainties. The pandemic effects, we still are not certain of exactly when we will get back to a steady state, because we don't feel like we're there now. Mr. Kruger and I had discussions about that. I know Mr. Gross, you and I have talked about that. We continue to monitor national reports. We were looking at CBRE Hotels Research report just the last few days, and they're looking at their annual update, their May edition. Their projections are looking at U.S. hotels that they're projecting back to normal in calendar year 23. And normal is in their forecasts will be higher ADRs and higher RevPARs. One thing in this report that was especially interesting to us was the statements concerning drive-to and leisure hotels would continue to outperform others. And obviously, with Jekyll being in both of those categories, we don't know exactly what to expect, but we think that our numbers will continue to be strong. And this report goes on to talk about, even in light of the increased cost that Americans are traveling. Now, obviously, there are some uncertainties that we've talked about that could occur that could definitely adversely impact our numbers. And if that were to be the case, then we have built into our projections a way to address that. And we'll talk about that some, especially when we get to our capital projects that we're recommending beyond those in the operational budget. And those capital projects, some of them could be postponed because they've not started and there's no obligation as far as a match or any kind of grant award associated with them. And so if we were to get into a situation where that occurred, for instance, like when the pandemic first was announced and our revenues went down 75% in the first month, then we would begin to pull back just like we did during that period. And we would come back to the board and we would recommend that rather than moving forward with certain capital projects, that we would recommend that those monies be used to meet obligations, operational obligations. We think that would be more prudent than dipping into reserves. And so that would be the plan that we would look to execute. Also, another study that I meant to mention was Condé Nast. In a late edition of their online surveys indicated that Americans are more concerned and unhappy with U.S. airlines than I suppose in history. And especially as the summer is progressing and airline cancellations and costs going up. So to me, that just feeds that idea of a driving destination as being one that is going to do well. We have made certain estimates. Marjorie and I have tried to stay on top of this, but some things have changed even in the past week. And just yesterday, Noel was able to give us the numbers from our operations, our operational revenues for the month of May. In the month of May, we were 126% of budget. And so May was robust, and May just continues to surprise us as far as this fiscal year. Of course, we still have June, and we're anticipating that June will also be a significant month. So we've tried to incorporate all of those ideas into this year's budget, but obviously there's some projections that we're just not able to make. So we'll continue to give you the estimates, and that's what you've received ahead of time. But obviously there will be some changes as the end of the year reports are finalized, and Marjorie and her team will be doing that, of course. The JIA reserves remain healthy. We estimate that we have approximately, or don't estimate, but we have approximately $4.7 million in our reserves at this point in time. If you look at the budget sheets that you received, we're anticipating an additional amount available for capital or cash reserves at 1.667840 when this year ends. And as I just indicated, that's all according to what happens in June. It could be higher than that. There is one change that I'm going to bring forward to you when we were talking about the actual capital sheet. But very healthy as far as the reserves are concerned. And also, I think it's very important too for everyone to realize that all of our special funds, such as the Tourism Development Fund, the funding for our fire fund, our wastewater and water capital requests, all of those are being met in these projections. And as we plan for the future, for instance, you look at the fact that we are about to have our new public safety facility under construction. And certainly that means that we're looking at additional equipment that will be required, and we're making our progress toward a ladder truck. And we anticipate at the end of next year, if this budget is approved, that we'll have, Marjorie, what's the number, 875?
875,000.
Toward the purchase of that ladder truck. And the estimates there are 1.2, 1.3 for the
I think that
truck.
was the last I heard. Yeah.
And so we have been planning toward this now for some time. And so that's just an example of where this budget allows us to go. Want to highlight a couple of other things. The proposed parking fee allocations in this budget are once again specifically earmarked. They're earmarked for conservation, sanitation, landscaping, roads and grounds, public safety, special events, park services, historic preservation, and guest information center operations. And that doesn't mean that all of those items, that their budgets, those departments in their entirety are covered, but it means there are specific portions, allocations from the parking fee that would be allocated. For instance, if you, the one that would be basically all of the operations would be guest information center, because obviously they operate the gate. But one that would be just a portion would be the one that I talked about just a minute ago, as far as looking at $100,000 toward, no, 175,000 next year toward the public safety, which would be for the ladder truck. So we're very specific as far as how those dollars are allocated. You received in your packet a pie chart, and Marjorie, if you'd like to go through those numbers as far as those allocations, I think,
Okay.
you know, where we're anticipating the revenues coming from for next year, that would be appropriate.
Okay. For the FY23 budget, one of the interesting things on here is that amenities is 46% of the total budget this year. Last year was only 44%. So the revenues from amenities has increased. The others have kind of stayed the same, but I'll go through those just so you kind of know where the funding is coming from. So amenities is 46% of the total budget. Residential leases is 2%. Parking fees is 16%. Commercial leases are 16%. Hotel taxes is 7%. Utilities and maintenance is 7%, and then other is 6%.
Any questions on where those items, the breakdown of the overall budget before I go into some more specifics? Marjorie, would you like to say anything else about that?
It might be interesting to note that convention center is included in amenities, and that's one of the reasons why it's up this year as opposed to last year.
If you look also in the proposed budget that you received, there are several studies that are included. And one of those would be, for instance, an update to the 2017 economic impact analysis. And we would recommend that the Selig Center from UGA do that update. They did the original analysis, so we want the methodology to remain the same. And the reason for that study would be that study looks at the impact of Jekyll Island on Glenn County and the state of Georgia. And obviously then whenever we're looking at any kind of funding requests beyond just our typical budget, then that study will be important to us. Also, we're looking at an ecological and outdoor recreation concept design study. This would be is anticipated to be part of the golf course improvements plan, and the board will be hearing recommendations from me regarding the golf course improvements plan at your regular meeting later this month, June 21st, I believe that is. Is that right?
Correct.
The 21st. But to actually have inputs, professional inputs on ecological and outdoor recreational concepts that would include that area. Also $25,000 for a water master plan and $25,000 for a water sewer rate study. And that ties into when we talk, Mr. Chairman, about the increase in fees. That particular study ties into that, because what we're looking at is to do a more an in-depth study of area and similar water systems and similar in size and operations to Jekyll Island, so that we know that we are where we should be as far as our charges and our reserves and associated costs. This, of course, ties back to the capacity study. The capacity study was very emphatic about keeping up with our water and sewer costs and making certain that improvements are made there over time, as they should be. Another item that we've included in here that I'd like to specifically address, because when I was hired and I came here and we began revitalization, one of the issues, and Mr. Kruger, you will certainly be able to speak to this. One of the issues was that we had the hotels on the island had basically become substandard, and that was driving basically driving everybody away, and consequently Jekyll was in financial straits. And the whole emphasis of revitalization was to bring back facilities that would result in people returning to the island. Obviously, the first facility there, the cornerstone, was to construct a new convention center. One of the reasons that the hotels were in such poor condition was we had most of the hotel properties were not flagged. So there were no requirements by a chain to reinvest necessarily in the hotels. In the old leases, the Jekyll Island Authority also did not have capital reserve requirements within the hotel leases. So as things have changed and as revitalization has come about, it is very important now that we're 10 years in with our new facilities. It is very important that we make certain that our partners who have reserve requirements, that those reserves are being cultivated, maintained, and then used appropriately. And while the state has been certainly looking at those accounts during the audits that the state does, we are very much aware of the issue of not allowing history to repeat itself in this case. And so we have internally had meetings to talk about the expenditure of capital reserves and what is appropriate. And so we're looking at next year, and all of this will be communicated to our partners that require capital reserves. We are looking at looking to have audits that would review the capital required accounts as called for, required in the leases, and also then verification of the expenditures. And so that particular study is included in this budget, and it is so important that I felt like that it was worthy of a few minutes of discussion this morning, Mr. Chairman. Marjorie, would you like to add anything you'd like to add to that? If I covered that?
Yeah, I think you covered it all, except that we do have funding in the budget to sustain that.
Right, that we do have money included under our studies for accomplishing this. Zach, anything that you'd like to say about that? You need to come toward this mic.
Thank you, Mr. Hooks. Members of the board, yeah. So we're looking hard internally at ensuring that our lessees are adequately planning for the sustainability of their properties and the longevity of their property, so that we avoid the situations and the circumstances that necessitated a robust revitalization effort so many years ago. And as part of that, as Mr. Hooks said, we'll be looking at bringing in third-party experts to take a hard look at those numbers in an audit format. We'll be communicating those expectations to the lessees to the extent they're not already aware of it in their own leases. And we'll be working toward everybody ensuring that they're on the same page and that they're meeting their obligations, so that Jekyll continues to be the jewel of the state.
Mr. Kruger, any comments from you on that particular issue?
No, I think that you were kind in saying that Jekyll needed some attention when we first started. And I think that we have adequately addressed it as far as the reserve component is concerned. I think the main thing is to get on board with our hotel partners to make sure that they do have an ongoing program of refurbishment and renewal.
Joe just arrived. I apologize.
Thank you, sir. You're live in the room.
Also, as we look at some other numbers, and these have been highlighted to board members, I think it's interesting that that as we consider the recommended budget, and we also look at like the most recent number of revenues, a good barometer of how amazing and robust things have been in the last couple of years would be to look at the Life is Good shop in the Beach Village. We actually run that shop, our retail division. We don't wear a big Jekyll Island Authority banner up there or anything, because everything done in that shop is handled just as though it were leased out to a third party. They have to pay their rent, they have to pay all of their expenses just like a third party. And that was the way that was designed from the beginning. And I think it's interesting to look at, if you look back 6 years ago when that shop was established, its first year after its build out costs, it lost about $8,000. And if you look at the revenues from this year, its revenues are in what you would consider, if you were a private company, and profits would be $121,473, and that's after all expenses. So that's quite a turnaround, and obviously Brian O'Neill, our retail manager, does a great job and can take a lot of credit for that. But I also think it's indicative of just the numbers. And when we say that, then I want to talk just a minute about capacity, because our capacity study, of course, continues to be one that is of utmost importance to us as we look at various issues. And the capacity study drives so many of our critiques and so many of the directions that we head in. And as we look at next year, one of the other items in the listing will be, just like we're looking at the water and sewer, looking at comparable systems. One of the other items will be that we'll continue internally to assess the gate revenues and the balance there as far as daily versus annual passes, and also then dynamic pricing. Because in the capacity study, it talks about the importance of dynamic pricing. And this board has moved forward in that direction by increasing fees during certain events. And that it was reflected earlier when I mentioned that a portion of the gates goes to special events. Well, that's that $4 differential that the board approved earlier for, like, the 4th of July, for instance. But as we move forward, there may be a need, based on the capacity and based on our experiences and based on the recommendations of that study, there may be a need for those numbers to be changed or more dynamic than they have been. And it may be that those numbers will need to increase to a higher level. The capacity study points out that in order to affect behavior, that the way you affect it with Americans is through the pocketbook. Well, obviously, a couple of dollars is not necessarily going to bring about the outcome that you may be looking for. And so we're going to be assessing and looking and reviewing that as we move forward, because that is something, that gate, and whether or not there is a need, for instance, for the board to consider a weekend rate during the summer being higher than a weekday rate. And so all of those kind of issues are going to be looked at and on the table as we go forward. Obviously, when you have just one way on and one way off the island, there's only so much you can do as you become a destination that is more desirable. But there are ways to balance that out, and so we'll be looking at that. There is one as we, well, let me stop there and see if there are any questions that I've maybe not touched on that board members have asked, or any comments that you might have, Chairman Gross, on the overall overview of the operational budget.
Don't have any questions, but I mean, I think it goes, a lot of hard work has been put in by you guys, the staff, and it's reflected in this. This is many years of just turning the crank to get the right momentum in the direction for the whole island and the authority. So good job on that.
Well, let us take, any other board members have any questions or comments before we move into the capital listing?
Hey, Jones, this is Mark. In the overall consolidated, I guess the second slide, the pay increases, are they just specific and targeted? I didn't see in the notes and I may have just missed it. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, the pay increases that are reflected basically are the ones that y'all approved in the in your April board meeting, but they're now reflected in this budget. We were able to go ahead and fund those so that they took place. If you recall, we were able to fund that out of this year's, the remainder out of this year's budget. But then these numbers, those numbers that you approved at the April meeting are then the numbers that are included here in this budget. Now, that doesn't mean this is an additional, it means this is what you've already approved. Did that answer the question, Marjorie?
We did not do an additional pay increase for this year.
Okay. I got you. That was it. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Jones, I have a question from a historical perspective. When we started revitalization, you mentioned that this was the highest budget that Jekyll Island Authority had been presented. What was the budget number when we began? Do you have that right off the top of your head somewhere in the neighborhood?
Mr. Kruger, when I arrived here in the 2008 budget, it was about $15.4 million operational budget. And you may recall that first year when I got here, man, that was a heck of a year, Bob. When I first got here, we were having so many financial issues. For the benefit of newer board members, we actually had to lay off about 40 to 50 employees. I'm not talking about furlough, and I'm talking about permanent layoffs. The first year I was here, just to meet budget. So it was a tight time.
Thank you. I could not remember the number, and I just wondered, and thank you for bringing that forward.
Well, we've come a long way in 14 years, no doubt about it.
I would say so.
If there are no other comments or questions, we'll, on the overall comprehensive budget, we do need to address with you the capital equipment and projects request, and then the rate increases that are proposed, and then the incentive plans that are required to be approved by the board each year. Marjorie just reminded me of something that we need to talk about first, and that is in the operational budget, you remember there's always a line item that addresses retirement. And Marjorie, if you would handle that, please.
Okay. After we completed the budget process and sent it out, we got notification from the employees' retirement system that the rates were increasing by 6% for next year. 6% may not sound like a lot, but when you're looking at a $10 million full-time budget, that's $600,000. The good news is, in the past, we've had to, if an employee had forfeited leave.
Wait a minute, 10 million full-time payroll budget.
Payroll budget,
Right.
yes, sorry.
I didn't want anybody to get confused over which budget we're talking about.
Yeah, in the past, we've had to pay the retirement portion on whatever forfeited leave an employee had when they retired. And if they came from another state entity, we had to pay it on the full amount, not just our portion. So we have been budgeting for those retirement payouts. So I have 250,000 set aside for that, which will help offset the 600,000. But instead of trying to do a budget change now, what we would like to do is just let the budget ride as it is, and with vacant positions and timing of open positions, that kind of stuff, I think we'll be okay by the end of the year. For example, right now we have 32 vacant positions. And so that'll help cover some of that. And if mid-year, if we look like we're not able to cover that, then we'll come back and ask for a budget adjustment on that. But right now the plan is to just cover it out of what we have.
Question. So therefore, the operational numbers really don't change then if we
Right.
move forward as recommended by Marjorie.
Yeah, and just so you're aware, we have two different plans for the full-time staff. And under the new plan, which is we have 27 employees on, the rates for next year will be 31% of their gross income. And the GSEPS plan, which is a combination of a 401k matching plan and retirement plan, those rates are 27.47%. So it's a pretty big chunk of our budget. And then we also had the increase in the 401k matching for this year, which is included in the budget because we knew that was coming. So just in retirement alone, we're looking at about a $800,000 increase for this year.
Now and I think board members understand this, but that is not something that we dictate. That is dictated by the state.
That is.
Any further comments on that, questions?
Good.
Okay, if not, we'll go to the capital request sheets. Capital request, there are a couple of things that I want to highlight for you. One is that we do have $30,000 in this request for a site design study or a siting and design study for pickleball. We have had lots of interest in pickleball on the island. And so we're proposing that we include in this budget the beginning of looking at where we would site pickleball and the design for that for courts. We also, there's an addition to the sheets that the board received that I want to talk about that just occurred last week. And if you recall, at the moorings, the development group is required. One of the items that we required basically as an impact of that development was for the development group to pave Harbor Road once the development was completed. Harbor Road, we knew would get in even worse condition as a result of the construction traffic. And that has definitely been the case. There's no doubt that it's gotten much worse. The road then off of Harbor Road leading to the marina is a private road, which has always been paved by the lessee and will continue to be. But there are other infrastructure enhancements like to the parking area down in the marina and the paving of that road to the restaurant that are all called for as part of the development agreement with the development group for the moorings. And so as that project has moved forward, the only hiccup was that as a result of the pandemic, you'll recall that you as a board extended the construction time for the project or a postponement of the last building because of the pandemic, to allow the development group time to assess, I suppose, financially and otherwise, the causes and effects as far as their project would be concerned and resulting from the pandemic. So that final building is now under construction. And most of the heavy trucks will have been through that area for the construction very soon now. And so we have had discussions with the development group about moving forward with the pavement of Harbor Road, which is really needed. When we got into that discussion, rather than just paving it back to the same width it is as is the requirement in the development agreement, Noel had discussions with the developer, and in order to strengthen the shoulder and widen the road, since we have traffic back and forth there from the water and wastewater plant, some pretty big equipment, we think it would be prudent to widen that road. And it would protect the road as far as its future if it's widened, and because the shoulders would be strengthened too. In order to do that, our share of that improvement would be $59,063. And so we are proposing to you that in this capital request sheet that we add $59,063. And the bottom line with the pickleball site design study and the improvements that are outlined there would be $2,132,763. And that would include the $59,063. Noel, anything that you'd like to add to that as far as that particular project? Marjorie, any other numbers there that I need to highlight? So our capital request, the first sheet, that number would be 2,132,763, and then the next sheet, those numbers all remain as proposed. The water wastewater capital request is $340,000. Tourism Development Fund is $350,000, and I want to mention to you that as the foundation looks to move forward with an expansion of the Georgia Sea Turtle Center, and they are in the midst of a RFP review right now for a company to do a feasibility for that project. Then we would recommend that from our tourism development funds that we begin to set aside funds toward what would become the JIA share of an estimated or anticipated expansion of the Georgia Sea Turtle Center. This would be the first of that. That project is estimated right now to be anywhere from $8 to $12 million. So it will be a major project. And so our portion of that, if you look at some of the foundations we've dealt with in the past, those foundations usually require a 50% match from the owner. And so our number will go up significantly. I'm not saying that our match would be, if it's a $12 million project, that it would be a $6 million match. But I am saying that if you received $1 million grant from a foundation, they may require that the JIA also put in $1 million. And so this budget, we would begin to plan toward that by including $350,000 from our tourism development fund. The public area improvements are spelled out there, and would total $667,025. I should note, I suppose, too, jumping back to the operational budget, since it has come up during our ordinance discussion, there is money in the operational budget for our continued reforestation efforts on the island. There's $15,000 included in the budget for that. So, Mr. Chairman, what I have here is the capital request as modified in the discussion, or revised in the discussion to you, to include the $59,063, as well as then the additional fund contributions totaling $667. And that would be for consideration by the board.
Very good. Well, at this time, the Finance Committee will consider the fiscal year 2023 budget and its components for recommendation to the Jekyll Island Board of Directors. Number one is going to be the capital equipment and projects request. Is there a motion for the Finance Committee to recommend approval of the capital equipment and projects request to the JIA Board as recommended by staff?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second, Glenn.
Who made the motion?
Joe.
Joe, okay. And the second is by Glenn.
Yes, sir.
Any discussion? All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries on that. Is that vote good for you?
Yeah, that's good.
Good.
Now, Mr. Chairman, we'd like to review the proposed rate changes.
Yes, sir.
And those would include several items. The looking back at the capacity issue at the gate, when we approved the annual, when we approved the daily pass increase back in the FY20 budget, the annual pass basically did not see that same increase, because at that time we were still requiring transponder stickers with the old equipment, and those were a $13 charge for an annual pass holder. And so the annual passes really began to be a better deal, so to speak, than the daily passes. What we did, what has occurred then, is we have skewed the annual pass revenues and numbers at basically the expense of the daily pass. Now we're seeing some movement there. And we're, as I indicated earlier, we're going to be really digging deep into this as we go next year, because of looking at capacity. And Marjorie, you have those numbers as far as looking at actuals. Can you bring those forward?
Yes, sir. In looking at May by itself, The daily traffic compared to last year is down by 23%. And Memorial Day weekend, the annual pass traffic and prepaid traffic was on target with budget, but the daily pass tickets were down 28 to 36%. So people are seeing that there's a really good deal with the annual pass and buying that if they're going to be here more than a couple of days. So it does impact revenue.
And basically, if you made 7 trips to the island, your annual pass paid for itself. And so what we're looking at, or the recommendation is that the annual pass increase go from $55 to $75 to try and get this, to try and look at this situation and balancing there. I also am bringing forward to you that as we look at capacity, I think that there is some opportunity for us to look at annual pass costs being even greater. At the same time, I think that it will be an opportunity for the board to look at annual pass costs for island residents, perhaps not being the same as the ultimate cost that may be ultimate fee that may be charged for an annual pass. But that would be something that we would look at in this overall review as we begin to tweak these numbers and have this dynamic system so that we can then come forward with a better recommendation to you for next year. But in this budget, the budget that you have before you, we're recommending that the annual pass increase from $55 to $75, and that the oversized vehicle annual pass increase from $100 to $120. The utility rates, we're recommending that a $2.50 per meter increase in the base fees for water and sewer. And that's across all water and sewer users. But that is no increase in the usage rate because of what I indicated earlier. We'll be looking to have a detailed study to do an analysis for us with like systems and to make sure that we're where we need to be as far as recommendations in the future as far as usage. So that'll be a total per meter base in FY23 of $5 is what that amounts to. The trash fees are being increased by 3%. That is not our increase. That is waste management increase. That is a pass-through. Golf course, golf rounds would be increased as outlined, and rates from June to December 31st will remain the same. January 1st to May 31st would increase from 8 to 12 a.m. to p.m. would go to $75 per round from $69. 12 to 2 would go to $55 from $50. And 2 to twilight would increase to $50 from $45. Those rates remain competitive with other courses in the area. As a matter of fact, we still remain basically the lowest cost. Golf punch cards would increase 21 round to $900, 11 round to $500, and 30 round walking to $850. Those are basically less than $100. They're $40 to $100 based on whether it's with a cart or walking, that sort of thing. The campground, the increase would be of $3 per night to cover the new reservation fee that we've installed and implementing. And our campground rates still remain some of the lowest in the area. Intern housing, Jenna has turned that around over the past few years since that's been under her. We would look to increase that at a cost to from $50 to $60 per week. That is for the interns and seasonal JIA staff. And the external rental would be a rate of $400 per week per house. And that is if we have houses that are not being used by JIA employees, but if we can make those available to hotels for their employees or otherwise, then that would be the proposed rate for that. The summer wage rates, I sure hope you approve them. If not, we'll have a rollback. Anyway, we're in the summer rate waves, and the rate would be daily admission rate to 28, from 20 to 25 to 28. There's a little differential there based on group size and that sort of thing. Group rates, the weekend hire. The group rate is proposed at $22 from $17. The season pass would increase from 63 to 74 or 75 to 80, and that's with no discounts for multiple passes, and that's here again the weekend. Season pass buddy rates would be $20, and that's an increase from $14, and the staff pass rate is from $14 to $20. The Georgia Sea Turtle Center rate increased for the patrols from 160 to 175 and the night to cover the added cost and especially with personnel now that we will not be using AmeriCorps staff would be from 160 to $250. And in the museum rentals, you have those to 3,500 and 5,000 based on 7 hours, and that's Villa Ospo and Hollybourne, and that includes staff being present on site during the entire time. So, Mr. Chairman, those are the proposed rate increases.
Thank you, Jones. Is there a motion for the Finance Committee to recommend approval of the rate increases to the JIA board as recommended by staff?
So moved. This is Bob Kruger.
Is there a second?
Second, Glenn.
Any discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye. Aye.
Any opposed? Unanimous. Thank you. Number 3, incentive plans.
I got you. This is Jenna. So some of you may recall a couple of years ago, we were required to put in place a incentive pay policy. And according to that policy, each year when we are reviewing and you are approving and reviewing and approving the budget, and you would also review and consider the incentive pay plans. It does consist of 3. The first being the performance incentive plan. There have been no changes to that plan from last fiscal or the current fiscal year to the upcoming fiscal year. The second would be the goal-based plan. We did make a change there just to add the guest information center assistant manager role to be eligible to receive part of the allocation on that if the goals are met. And then the last being the hiring incentive plan. We did update the title position for the deputy executive director role. And then we did add the water and wastewater assistant superintendent role for that plan as well.
Jenna, I want to apologize for not introducing you, Jenna Johnson.
It's okay.
Is there a motion for the Finance Committee to recommend approval of the incentive plans to the JIA board as recommended by Jenna and staff?
Mr. Buster, make a motion.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? It's unanimous. All right, number 4. The fiscal year 2023 proposed budget and its components. Is there a motion for the Finance Committee to recommend approval of the fiscal year 2023 budget and its components to the JIA board as recommended by staff?
So move.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Unanimous. Very good. That concludes our finance portion of this meeting. I would turn it back over to Dale Adkins as the chair for the committee as a whole. On the whole.
Thank you, Mr. Bill. I will now open the floor for any public comments. Please remember, all comments are limited to 3 minutes per person.
Any public comments? Sir, you're good to move on.
We'll move on to the committee of the whole. The first item is the revised first reading of proposed code revision update from Jones and Zach. And I'll call on Jones to begin the short discussion of the revisions along with Glenn Coyne.
Actually, Mr. Chairman, Glenn, if you're on the phone, if you will go ahead and move right into that, that item, that would be great in the interest of time.
I am. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Yes. Thank you. Hello again to the board members. Thank you for having me back. It's Glenn Coyne with GMC. And very briefly today, we wanted to update you on our code revision project. As you recall, on May 17th at the board meeting, we presented in pretty fair detail the proposed revisions to all of the chapters that we've been working on to you at that meeting. Since that date, we have received a few additional public comments. We received comments from board members, and we had a couple of other meetings with JIA staff, and we've identified just a few revisions to those chapters that we'd like to let you know about today, and then have that be considered as a revised first reading for those changes. So very briefly, the largest amount of changes that we made to the chapters had to do with a series of sections in most of the chapters that dealt with violations, penalties, and enforcement. And working with Zach Harris, the general counsel, who did the heavy lifting on this, we compared all of the different penalty and violation language throughout the code and tried to make it more clear and more consistent, so that if someone is found in violation of a certain section of the code, unless there's a specific reason for it to be different, then the language is very similar. And that was something that we wanted to do to simplify, clarify, and be consistent throughout the code. So I'm not going to go through each of those individually unless you have questions, but in the summary information that we provided you, we've highlighted which chapters and which sections that clarity and consistency language was made for violations, penalties, and enforcement. Then there are two other changes that I wanted to highlight this morning. One had to do with the landscape and tree protection ordinance. And throughout the process, and even since the May 17th meeting, we've received a lot of comment and concern about the mitigation requirements for replacing trees. And so we have in section 6 of the landscape and tree protection ordinance, we have added additional language that does provide for a appeal process. If a leaseholder or owner, if something happens to a tree during, say, a storm or some other type, if it's diseased or if there's something that's not of the fault of the leaseholder or owner, there is a requirement that that tree be, the mitigation is put in place for that tree. What we have done is added a clause that the executive director acting on behalf of the authority may, if there's good cause and sufficient documentation to back it up, they can, he may waive the requirement for mitigation based on that analysis of what that good and sufficient cause might be. So that is all to say there is now a remedy if there is something that happens to a tree that's not the fault of the owner or leasee, that there is a way for the authority to work with that owner or leasee to grant a condition or adjust or be able to determine that that tree may not need to be mitigated under certain situations. So that was important to a lot of folks, and we wanted to highlight that as a new clause that allows that appeal and approval of that appeal. And then the other section that we received feedback on that we did make an edit to is in the building code chapter, chapter D, and it's the very last section of that chapter. And we had described to you at the May 17th meeting and all along the process that we were wanting to make sure there was a way to ensure that taller buildings on Jekyll Island were structurally safe going into the future. And one thing that we wanted to do was to establish an inspection procedure for those taller buildings to make sure there's not any structural or foundational cracks or any other kind of weakness that might be emerging in those buildings. So we did have some language in there that required that. We've clarified that language to be specific about the types of buildings that are covered under this, that they have to be 40 feet or taller, and that these inspections would be required every 5 years by either a structural engineer or an architect, and that report would be submitted to the authority on file so that we make sure that these buildings are safe going into the future. We also have specifically exempted single-family residences from this. So this is really intended to be for businesses, institutional buildings, and taller condominium and hotel type buildings. So, so that change, that clarification was made to that section. So, Mr. Chairman and other members of the board, again, with most of the changes being to the violation penalties and enforcement clauses, and then those two I just highlighted, that's pretty much the only revisions that we're recommending that to the chapters that were presented to you back on May 17th. And again, I will reiterate that we've made several amendments before we got to you on May 17th to the codes based on public involvement. I think it's important to acknowledge the how many comments we received and how we read each and every one of them and incorporated as many of them as we could. But these last few were important enough, I think, to bring to your attention, which we've wanted to do that today. So again, unless there's any questions, I want to thank you again for your attention to this, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Glenn. This is Zach. And I just want to add to Glenn's comments that in the general approach to this project was to provide clarity to the ordinances, to remove redundancies, to update them, to ensure that they accurately reflect the authority's practices, and to modernize them where appropriate. In looking at the in the various sort of tweaks and revisions that have happened over the course of this project, the authority staff has solicited public comment, public input, and all the staff members involved in this project have looked and reviewed studiously the comments that were submitted by members of the public. Some of the comments that came up a couple times, we have looked hard at, and the revisions in front of you reflect that. Generally, as to the penalty and enforcement provisions, the standard approach will be consistent with the prior practice under the current ordinances of citation for ordinance violations generally, where those citations are appropriate under the circumstances, and that consistent approach is reflected in these ordinances with substantially similar enforcement language. And where appropriate, there are additional remedies available to the authority to halt ongoing violations outside of just a standard ticket or citation approach. And in sections where that's important, that language is set out. Generally, it's my understanding that the authority has a good record of working with lessees and business owners to reach a cooperative resolution to violations, and Jekyll's not in. We're not really interested in being heavy-handed about issuing citations. So, but we do need to ensure that there is a mechanism to obtain compliance with these ordinances when the circumstances call for those mechanisms. So that was the approach there, and we wanted to make sure that those penalty language, those penalty sections had more or less consistent language as opposed to a scattershot approach. As Glenn said, on the other substantive changes or revisions, we did want to be clear in what we were looking for particularly on the building inspection or commercial building inspection requirements, and we did very much appreciate the substantive comments by members of the public and board members on that in that respect. There were a couple of comments that we chose not to dive into and make any substantive changes in response to. One of those dealt with e-bikes or electric bicycles. This board did look at rentals of e-bikes in 2020 or 2021 with an ordinance that allowed them but did not allow the rental of them on Jekyll for policy reasons and in consideration of the capacity issues that would be created by additional source of bicycles on Jekyll. What we have done in this version of the ordinance is default to state law under Chapter 6 of Title 40 pertaining to the rules of the road that are established law under Georgia as concerns e-bikes. On Jekyll Island, state law we would default to state law, which says essentially for Class 1 and Class 2 bikes, e-bikes, that is, they are presumptively allowed on mixed-use paths. And for Class 3 e-bikes, they are presumptively not allowed. At this time, and we might look at this a little harder in the future if the need arises, but at this time, given the scope of the ordinance revision, we wanted to, we did not have a strong policy incentive to dive into e-bike regulation. So we're defaulting to state law at this time, and we're going to perhaps take a harder look in the future. Another comment that came up consistently or frequently from a couple of folks is a request that Jekyll Island Authority enact a a land use map or zoning map on Jekyll. There are a couple of reasons that we're not supporting that position. One of which is Jekyll Island is state property. It's a little different from a local government in how it operates. Jekyll already regulates land use under a lease regime that's authorized under state law. Generally, the Jekyll Island Authority operates Jekyll Island as a state park with leased out residential and leased out commercial areas. So the authority does regulate land use internally. And at this time, other than a guidance map that provides informational purpose, that provides information, we're not supportive of a general zoning land use regime on Jekyll. And so that's why you don't see a zoning map adopted as a part of this ordinance revision. And if there are any other questions, Glenn and I are happy to speak to those.
Okay, hearing no questions. This being the revised first reading, no motion is needed. We'll now open the floor for public comments. Please remember, comments are limited to 3 minutes per person.
Greg Patterson, representing the Jekyll Island Citizens Association. Just want to thank GMC and JIA for their review on the tree mitigation issue. And we're happy to hear that there is an appeal process in the planning now, and we look forward to that being codified in the future. Thank you.
Sir, that is the only public comment.
Thank you. Okay, before adjournment or asking for a motion to adjourn, I would like to remind everyone of the June 21st board meeting. I would like for everyone, if possible, to attend in person. It's a very important meeting. All our meetings are important, but if possible, try and attend in person. And at this time, I'll ask, is there a motion to adjourn?
So move.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor for the meeting to adjourn, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, like sign? The time is now 10:50, and this meeting is adjourned. Thanks all of you for attending.
Mark Williams. Have a good day. Mark, you still on?